Well, the second album we're going to talk about this week is Between the Buttons, an album titled Between the Buttons, which many Americans may not know the meaning of it. Me being an American, I had to look it up. But apparently, in Great Britain, the phrase between the buttons means something is undecided. So when Charlie Watts asked Andrew Loog Oldham, what's the name of the next album? Andrew Loog Oldham said, well, Charlie, it's Between the Buttons right now. And Charlie Watts, being a sort of former design student and pretty handy with a pen and paper in terms of drawing and that kind of thing. Charlie Watts was kind of, if John Lennon was the kind of guy with the funny sketches in the Beatles, Charlie Watts was that guy in the Rolling Stones. He thought, Between the Buttons, that's interesting. So what they ended up doing for the packaging is they ended up calling the album Between the Buttons, and on the back of the album you get like this panel of cartoons by Charlie Watts, sort of on the theme of Between the Buttons. It's a little bit nonsensical, sort of in the same kind of way A Hard Day's Night or Help are kind of nonsensical. But then this again draws our attention to a certain amount of packaging and attention on packaging that goes on here. And this time, instead of reading Andrew Loog Oldham's liner notes on the back, we're seeing a Charlie Watts cartoon. The album photo was done by a guy by the name of Jared Mankiewicz. Apparently to get the kind of spacey effect, the kind of out of focusness around the edges, they used Vaseline on the lens. You can look up the story that goes with that, but Mankiewicz are fairly proud of the album art on Between the Buttons. Recorded initially at RCA with Dave Hassinger engineering, but then in August of '66. But then it was finished at Olympic Studios with Glyn Johns doing the engineering in London, November, December of 1966. So Olympic is going to kind of become the new home for the Stones. They're not going to go back to RCA and work with Hassinger anymore, not because there's any problem or falling out, but it's much more convenient for them to record in London. And so at the end of '66, there they are finishing up the recordings. A lot of things were started at RCA in London and finished at Olympic. Well, because things had been started at RCA and because they'd worked with Jack Nitzsche a lot when they were in Hollywood recording, they actually flew him from Hollywood to London so that he could continue to work on those same sessions, and he appears all over this album. So released, recorded at the end of the summer and into the fall, into the winter season of '66. The album is released in 1967, January in the UK, and February in the US, as we've mentioned a couple times. It goes to number 3 in the UK, number 2 in the US. There are 14 Jagger Richards songs on this album overall, and the UK and the US versions contain only 2 different songs. So now we've got an album here that's almost the same album on both sides of the Atlantic. The difference being singles are included on the US recording that aren't included on the UK one. As I mentioned a couple of videos ago this week, Bill Wyman says that this was Between the Buttons was the first album that the Rolling Stones did thinking about the album as a whole, not as separate tracks. This gets back to this theme of the album as a kind of a coherent whole, and the development from a singles-oriented mentality where albums were secondary to more of an album-oriented mentality where singles weren't secondary, but the album coherence was really important, and that's a direction that a lot of groups are going at this time, as we've talked about here as well. So, produced by Andrew Oldham, as I said, and recorded both at RCA and Olympic, this would turn out to be the last Rolling Stones studio album that would say produced by Andrew Loog Oldham on it. The next album, Thirst of Tennis Majesties, simply says produced by the Rolling Stones. There's a fallout coming between the Stones and Andrew Loog Oldham. He's got plenty of other things going on, although I think now, when he looks back, he considers that period of time between '62 and '66 as sort of this golden period in the popular music business, because he was sort of masterminding, or at least playing a role in masterminding the careers of the Rolling Stones. He continued to be involved in the music business, and the books, as I've said before, I cannot recommend his books highly enough. They're fantastic sort of windows into the world of the 1960s and the Rolling Stones, the entertainment business. So they come highly recommended. But after this album, Andrew is kind of out of our story. So what are some of the songs that we have on this record. Well, let's spend the night together. Let me save discussion of that for the next video because that's a song close-up. Yesterday's Papers, that's an interesting kind of tune. It's got harpsichord, vibraphone, bass harmonica, it sounds to me like. And you know, the other group you hear a lot of bass harmonica in are those Brian Wilson recordings for the Beach Boys of about that time. So, you know, maybe Jack Nietzsche brought that with him back from Los Angeles when he came to London. But to me, there may be a kind of a Beach Boys influence. And again, here's what I'm going to do is talk about these songs in terms of the influences that they made of music that was either contemporary to the Rolling Stones or things that they'd covered before that, as a way of sort of seeing how influences are working on their music. Again, I reinforce, not because I think that there's any weakness in this, but I think this is the natural way with young musicians to be influenced by other music. And one of the things that musicologists do is try to tease out these influences if they're, you know, if they're obvious for certain, but even if they're not obvious. So that's what I'm doing here. So I mean no disrespect. Ruby Tuesday, released on the US version of the album only. Boy, some real classical touches on this one, and the use of the recorder, the little wooden flute. We'll talk about that in a song close-up. The song Connection, I don't know, to me it sounds like they could be trying to do a kind of a soul number, maybe something that they might think of Solomon Burke or Otis Redding or somebody like that doing You Can Decide for Yourself. Certainly, She Smiled Sweetly is a kind of Otis Redding, Solomon Burke kind of a soul tune. Again, an original tune. These are all original tunes. We're talking about influences, not tunes that were actually done by Otis Redding, but in the style of kind of thing here. Cool, Calm, Collected is a great overlooked tune, and I'm going to include it in the song close-ups in the next video. It's a great one for a lot of, I don't know if overall that's a great tune, but what the tune does is very interesting for revealing some of the things that are going on in the Stones' ideas about how they make their music. So let's just bracket that discussion for a little bit later. She Smiled Sweetly, or Please Go Home, really sounds to me like they're trying to do Bo Diddley. This one was released only on the UK version. All Sold Out really sounds kind of like 60s pop, heavy fuzz guitar meets Beatles vocals, I think. My Obsession, another kind of song with sort of Beatles, Beach Boys-ish background vocals. It's funny when you listen to these album tracks on something like Between the Buttons and you hear all this vocal harmony stuff going on that we don't usually associate with the Rolling Stones, right? Sort of backup harmonies and multi-layered and all this kind of thing. But it won't be the last time we're going to hear this kind of vocal harmony going on in their music. So the Beach Boys' influence on the Rolling Stones, I can't think of too many people who've talked about that, but boy, it's going to pop up a number of different times. You don't really think about the Beach Boys, the Rolling Stones as really, you know, being sort of on the same page with anything, but there it is. Who's Been Sleeping Here? This is the Rolling Stones under the influence of Bob Dylan, I think, and it's not the only song on the album that seems to have a very strong Dylan influence. Don't forget, in the middle of 1965, that's the big breakout period for Dylan as a solo artist, right? And so Dylan is all over the charts and is, of course, maybe the most highly revered songwriter in pop culture among this generation as anybody. So it's not unusual that there could be a very strong Dylan influence, but I certainly see it there. Complicated kind of reminds me of All Sold Out as being having kind of a 60s pop feel with heavy fuzz guitar, maybe kind of an ethnic folk feel. I think Miss Amanda Jones sounds to me like an up-tempo Chuck Berry tune, or somebody like Chuck Berry, Larry Williams, Little Richard, somebody like that. Something Happened to Me Yesterday is Keith Richards on lead vocal, and you know, it's almost like he is imitating Dylan. I'm not trying to make fun of him. I think it sounds like it could be a Dylan song like Rainy Day Women or something like that. That's the kind of feel the tune has. Even the vocal inflections that he uses sound very Dylan-esque. So I would say the influence there, primary one probably being Dylan. And then Backstreet Girl, which was on the UK only, a kind of an acoustic folk song with almost kind of a French concertina kind of feel in the center of it. Now, when we look at all of these influences across these records, this album, Between the Buttons and Aftermath, I think it's fantastic that the Stones' influences are so much broader and more eclectic, probably than any of the interests of their fans. I think I've said this before, if not in this series of lectures, in one of my other courses here on Coursera. My experience is that musicians almost always have a broader range of influences in music that they like than most of their fans do. And so it's interesting to see them embracing so many different kinds of music and working it into their sound. And so for those of us who do this kind of work, those are the interesting kinds of connections to find, to see a piece as really kind of just a node in a kind of web of various kinds of influences and styles and that kind of thing. And so I find these albums, both of these albums, to be extremely rich from that point of view. And we can base that on the fact that we know that they knew a lot of music because they did four albums practically of cover versions and other songs that they recorded that didn't make it onto albums. So we know they knew a lot of other people's music, and we know those tastes were very eclectic. Well, having now surveyed the album Between the Buttons, let's move in for some song close-ups from music from this period. Have You Seen Your Mother, Baby? Let's Spend the Night Together, Ruby Tuesday, and Cool, Calm, and Collected.